For physical science class. Today we're going to be talking about fresh water. It's state benchmark E4.1. The water cycle, which many of you are familiar with from earlier years in school. It's made of the process in which water goes to the atmosphere, falls to the earth, and returns to the atmosphere. The first step we'll talk about is evaporation. This is when water goes from liquid form into gas form. This usually comes from the sun heating it out of lakes and oceans. Related to evaporation is transpiration. This is when water vapor that is released into the atmosphere from the leaves of plants. So both of these take water from its liquid form and put it into a gas form. The next step is condensation. This is when water that's vapor gets cold and it turns into droplets. So you may have noticed this on a hot summer day if you had a cold glass of something to drink. Outside the glass, it turns to water. It's not the water going through the glass. What it is the air that has a lot of water in it, or water vapor in it, cools when it touches the glass and it forms water. And then you have, the next step is precipitation. When that water gets too heavy, it falls and comes down in these 5 types. And this explains how some of those come to be. Finally, once that water falls, it becomes runoff. And this is where the water finds its way into a river or a lake and eventually makes its way out into the ocean. Or you could have groundwater, which is where the water soaks into the earth and then eventually makes its way towards the ocean. Fresh water is water that does not contain salt. So when we talk about fresh water, we're not talking about water that is, fresh from the bottle or just poured or doesn't have chemicals in it. We're talking about water that is not salt water, and it can be found in these 5 locations. Most likely you will find it in glaciers. Of course, in glaciers it's frozen. So you're going to find most in the liquid form in groundwater. You'll also find water in the atmosphere, but it's going to be in the form of water vapor. And when it's cold and in those little particles, it connects with dust and it creates clouds. It may be up there for a couple of hours or even a few days. So eventually that water hits the ground and it needs to make its way towards the ocean. And when it does this, it shapes the land as it travels. This is called a watershed. This is a watershed of the Clinton River. And let's say Clintondale is right about here. So if it rains here, the water will follow a pathway to this tributary. This tributary will then drain into the Clinton River, which will then go out into Lake St. Clair. Eventually that water in Lake St. Clair will go down the Detroit River to Lake Erie, down the Niagara River to Lake Ontario, to the St. Lawrence Seaway, and eventually out to the Atlantic Ocean. So we are in the Clinton River watershed here, which is in the Lake Erie watershed, which is in the Great Lakes watershed. So there's multiple watershed areas. These are ponds and lakes are just depressions in the land where water collects. If it's small, it's a pond. If it's big, it's a lake. And it'll eventually drain into some other body of water. Groundwater controls 1/4 of all the fresh water in the world. If you ever had well water, what a well water is it digs a hole into the ground until it finds the water table and gets water out of there. The water is clean because of the aquifer, and this is that rock that lets the water flow through it, and it kind of filters the water as it goes. If you as a kid dug at the beach and you dug into the sand until you found some water, that's the water table. Because it's near the lake, it's going to be pretty close to the surface. As you get further from the lake or the ocean, the water table is going to be a little bit lower. And the last form of fresh water is glaciers. Glaciers form from snow piling up after each year. It'll melt a little bit in the summer, but then it'll repeat the process again as the winter begins. And there's 2 types. There's one that's on mountaintops, and then there's glaciers that form at the Arctic caps. If that glacier becomes broken, it's called an iceberg. Thank you for taking the time to watch this video. If you have any questions, please write them down and we can answer them in class.